constructive. And so now he's taking up the issue of eating meat that had been sacrificed to idols. Eating meat that has been sacrificed to idols that is purchased, it may have been sacrificed to idols, it doesn't matter, in the marketplace, and taking it home and eating it. And he's very clear there in verse, let's see here, verse 25. Eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience. For, and then in quoting the book of Psalm here, Psalm 24 and verse 1, he says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So everything belongs to God. Doesn't matter where it was processed or what process it went through to get to the meat market. You can eat it, and you can eat it without. It's not a matter of conscience. Shouldn't even enter into your conscience. Shouldn't be an issue with you. And but again, not everything is constructive. So even though that's true, he still says nobody should seek his own good but the good of others. And that's kind of just a rule of thumb. Whatever you're allowed to do, whatever God looks at as being a diaphora or indifferent, that still is not necessarily a license to do everything. So he's giving us now two examples of this adiaphora. Again, which these are things that are neither commanded nor forbidden. They are outside of any kind of moral category. They're indifferent things. And he says these are things that are indifferent to him that he shared. Not everybody's going to agree with Paul on all of these, but he believes they're in this category. And the first one is, as he said here, buying meat that may have been sacrificed to idols and eating it at home. That's okay. And you don't even have to ask. You don't have to ask where it came from. And you're not asking because you're sticking your head in the sand and saying, because if I find out that it has been sacrificed idols and I can't eat it, that's not the issue there. You don't have to ask because it's not an issue. And I talked about the fact that we do that all the time. We don't go to people's houses and when we sit down say, now, before I eat, I need to know. Because I have made an oath, I'll never eat anything from Fred Meyer, so did it come from Fred Meyer or not? Because if it is, I'm going to have to say I can't eat. If you're going to do that, then you better tell them ahead of time that you're not going to do that. But we don't do that. We don't ask people where the meat came from or where they bought it. And Paul's saying the same thing here. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where it came from. But the second one, and this is where we just got to last week. The second one has to do with you have been invited into an unbeliever's home, more than likely an unbeliever who's a Gentile, because a Jew's not going to be buying meat that he wouldn't be sure of just because of their own conscience sake. And Paul says if you're disposed to eat it, do what? Go ahead and eat it. Yeah. If you're disposed to accept the invitation. You don't have to accept the invitation just because a pagan has invited you to their home. You don't have to go. But if you're disposed to go and they've got the food sitting out on the table, and if you're disposed to eat it, then go ahead. Eat whatever is set before you without inquiring about it. But, and this is where we left off, he does place limits on his liberty in this last example that he gives here under a particular certain condition. And that is, let's just go ahead and read down through verse 30, starting at verse 27. If an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. But if anyone, or someone, some of your translations have, says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then don't eat it, both for the sake of the man who told you and for conscience sake, the other man's conscience, I mean, not yours. For why should my freedom be judged by another's conscience? If I take part in a meal with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of something I thank God for? So we need to set this up and understand what's going on. And listen, this is Paul's scenario. He's making this up. He's making this up to make a point, okay? So he can have anybody talking that he wants to have talk. And in this particular case, he says, I've been invited to this pagan's home. Last week we called him Eddie Pagan. So Eddie Pagan, I think that's what I said.
Billy Idol.
And Billy Idol, that's right. Eddie Pagan and Billy Idol. So Eddie Pagan has invited us to his home, and we're great. Maybe an opportunity to get to know Eddie better and maybe be able to share the gospel with him sometime down the line. And so he's invited me to dinner, and he also invited another person who is Billy Idol. That is, I believe, the someone here. Or in my translation, but if anyone says to you, I don't think it's the host. I don't think it can be the host. We have three possibilities. It can be the host, it can be a fellow pagan guest, or it can be a fellow believer that happens to be there. Listen, if you study this and look at different commentaries and people talking about it, all of those have proponents. All of those have people that will say, that's what I believe that it is. I doubt that it is a fellow believer, because the conscience of that one does not give that clue. I mean, if my brother in Christ who's there won't eat it, then I can understand that, okay? But verse 33 tells me, even as I try to please everyone in every way, for I'm not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. And if you go back up to verse 32, he doesn't want to cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, which would be a pagan unbeliever, or the church of God, which would be a fellow believer. So those are the three options that we have here. I think the clue to who this is used in how the meat is described here, where he says this has been offered in sacrifice. The word that Paul has used in speaking to Christians here about going to these pagan meals and the use of meat that he's used, the Greek word has always been idolophyton. Let me spell it for you. E-I-D-O-L, so it's kind of like idol. Idol, O-T-H-Y-T-O-N. So E-I-D-O-L-O-T-H-Y-T-O-N. And it's idol meat. That's how you translate that. He used that in chapter 8, verse 1, and he's used it every other time, except here. This word is hierophyton, which means sacrificed meat. And sacrificed meat would be what it was from a pagan's point of view. It's idol meat from somebody who's a believer, because there's this meat. But this is sacrificed meat. And that's how a pagan would view that same chunk of beef or whatever it has. So, and again, I doubt that it's the host, because he says, if anyone, the host has invited me, but if anyone, seems to indicate to me anyway, that we've got somebody else here in the room who is a pagan and who is an unbeliever. Pagan because of the way that he's used the word, and consequently an unbeliever. So let me ask you the question, what would motivate an unbelieving guest to make that kind of an announcement, or to take him aside, as it seems to, without, this person says to you, he doesn't announce it to everybody else, he says this to you, this has been sacrificed tonight. What would motivate that?
Like he's wanting to see what the reaction is, whether he's going to eat, whether he's not going to eat, whether...
Okay, it's a possibility. John?
Might be pride. If this is an unbeliever, and he doesn't necessarily have to whisper it to him, I can see them sitting at a table, and both unbelievers, the host and this person who says this to him, both go to this temple where they sacrifice this meat. He can pridefully turn to Paul and say, hey, this meat came from our temple.
Right. It's a possibility. Tammy?
It's also
they know that this person is a believer and they choose not to do other things that they think of as normal, maybe on the order of, I know you've stopped going to temples and all this, and you know, this, sacrifice the idol, you know.
Okay? Okay, so Tammy's saying maybe it's a person that's looking and says, I notice that you don't go to these places, so maybe let me tell you about this meat.
I tended to, this is a hypothetical as you're talking about, and who would know whether the meat has been sacrificed to the idol? Well, the host who's presenting it, so that's why I think it is the host that we're talking about here, just the way I've always looked at that. But if I know you've got an issue with that, I just want to let you know, this has been set maybe because he's looking out for you. That's
Yeah, and I think it's the same thing, except I don't think it's the host. Because if it was the host and he thought Paul would have an issue with it, he wouldn't have offered it to him in the first place. He wouldn't have bought it there in the first place. Or he would have told him ahead of time, by the way, we're going to be serving this.
I think Paul would have said it was the host if it was the host.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
She's making this story up anyway.
Right.
If somebody is there
Right.
that does this.
It's not difficult for me to think, okay, here's a Gentile. Paul's obviously a Jew. That he would think, you know, if he knew that this was sacrificed to an idol, he probably would like to know. He'd like to know ahead of time. He'd like to, because I don't want him to violate his conscience or do something that he thinks is sinful or wrong. And so he just is kind of, as an aside, telling him, by the way, this has been sacrificed to an idol. And what do we know about Paul with regards to that? From Paul's personal point of view, this meat, if he's told this meat was sacrificed to an idol, what does that difference is that going to make to Paul? None. Not a bit. Not a bit. Which also seems to tell me that this guy thinks that Paul would have an issue with it, which is why he's telling him. So back to Paul's point here, don't eat the meat. For whose sake? Not Paul's sake. The other guy's sake. So he's telling them, you're at a meal, you've been invited, somebody comes up to you and says this meat was sacrificed to an idol. So he says, don't eat. Not for your conscience. Is it a matter of conscience with the Christian? Shouldn't be anymore. So for the other guy's conscience, for the someone here that's told you about that, he's pointed out to you the sacrificial origins of this meat. I think that he's done so, he's felt some sort of sense of moral obligation to tell you that, to protect you from doing something without knowing about it. Last week, and I said, let's just not talk about this, and Daniel raised his hand. I thought it was about something else. And so he just opened up the floodgates, because he was at a party one time, and they made some sort of a hot toddy or something, and Daniel was talking about how wonderful it tasted. It was great. And a fellow Christian came up to him and said, well, you know, that's got rum and brandy and everything else in it. And I'm sure if it was heated up, there was no alcohol in it, but this other guy wasn't participating in it. And so Daniel said, and I don't know if he said this in class or he told me later, that he just kind of set it down and didn't have any more. Not for Daniel's sake. He wasn't going to, his concern is whether he got drunk or not. He wasn't going to get drunk, but for the conscience of the other guy. And then when the other guy, because he was just uncomfortable being there, left, he said, I took it back up again. I said, fine. There's not an issue with that. You know, you acted appropriately there. So Paul is saying this someone is acting towards us with a sense of moral obligation, saying, you know, this meat has been sacrificed to idols. And so what is in the back of that someone or anyone's mind? What's he think about Paul? He's thinking Paul probably would have a problem eating it. Now we know Paul doesn't, but he doesn't know that. And so in order not to offend this person who is a pagan, who is an unbeliever, who has a moral expectation that's incorrect about this Christian that's at the dinner party, Paul said, it's not a matter of conscience with me, it's a matter of adiaphora, it's an indifference, but it's best to forbear, to not participate, to not eat for that guy's, for Billy Idol's conscience and his view towards me. And why can Paul do that?
I'm thinking he did that because he doesn't want this individual to think that it's okay in any form to eat meat sacrificed to an idol, even as a pagan. He doesn't understand that, but I'm thinking he just doesn't want to violate, and that's not right. He just doesn't want to show that he's going to participate in something that this guy believes is holy.
Well, I don't think this guy believes it's wrong. He's there too. And I think that he's probably going to eat it. The fellow pagan that's there, he's going to enjoy it. Maybe he's thinking, this is a way I can get extra prime rib because I'll tell this guy that it's been offered to an idol and he won't be eating so much of it. I don't know, but I know that I think that the motivation is that he's trying to protect this fellow guest who's Paul. And the reason Paul can give it up is the same reason Paul could decide to eat. He's free to make that choice. That's a liberty. Just because he has a liberty to eat it, he has a liberty not to. Either way. And listen, we know from other passages, like Romans 14, where Paul does not allow a Christian to make food a matter of Christian conscience. In other words, he's going to tell in chapter 14 of Romans, so you see your brother doing that, who are you to judge your brother? To his own master he stands or falls. And so Paul doesn't allow a believer to make a judgment about another believer in a matter that the other believer believes is a matter of indifference. Which is why I don't believe that this is a Christian here. Yes?
It seems to me that Paul is concerned more about the person and their customs and not letting that get in the way of him being able to be saved. So he just takes it because
Right.
he knows that
It's not going to matter. And if that has opened up this guy's eyes and say, wow, look at him, look how committed he is as he's willing to do that. Then Paul can sit down with Billy Idol later and say, I really don't have an issue with this because I'm not eating it in worship to the idol. But I appreciated the fact that you thought that I wasn't. That's why I didn't have it, because I didn't want you to get the wrong idea.
Yeah, I think the point that he's making is this is the way you treat somebody like that.
Right? Again, what's Paul's main goal? To win souls.
Yeah.
And he doesn't want to do anything that's going to distract or detract or disrail that process with that guy. Yes?
I think what I see more maybe in Christianity today is when we get in those situations, the person that's been invited says, it might be sacrificed to idols, so I better not do it because I don't want to give the impression to anybody else out there that I might be doing something. I hear that
Right.
most frequently.
Hey, and I have been there. When I was a meat cutter, when I was doing other things, because we had this company that I worked for had a retail market, we had a custom cutting, which is farm killed that we cut up, and then there was a wholesale that serviced restaurants all over Central Washington over here on the west side too. And so sometimes they needed a driver, and so I went over and did deliveries for them, and delivering meat in taverns and stuff in Yakima, and Chinese restaurants, which almost broke me up going to Chinese restaurants when I walked into their refrigerators. I went back to them though. So anyway, let's say that in the course of my being there, that there was a guy there that I met, and he would like to have a Bible study, and he has he had time in the afternoon a half an hour or so in the tavern when he was taking his break that he would like to have a Bible study. And so I'd have to go there to have a Bible study with him. Now I'll tell you, I thought about that before, and I thought, well, I just couldn't go. Because what if another Christian saw me, what? Walking into a tavern or coming out of a tavern. And this is that's Romans 14. Who are you to judge me for that? But we can't allow that. And so here's the opportunity to teach, and now he's going to go on here. The criterion there in verse 24 is nobody should seek his own good but the good of others. And that's what he's doing here. When he says, I won't eat, he's not eating because of the issue that he would have with it, but because of the other guests there. He's thinking about the heart and the well-being of this pagan friend, even if he is a friend, and in that case he doesn't partake of that meat. And then he anticipates the question there in verse 30. So having said that, this has been offered to sacrifice, then do not eat it, both for the sake of the man who told you and for conscience sake, for his conscience, the other man's conscience, I mean, not yours. For why should my freedom be judged by another's conscience? See, why should my freedom to be able to eat that meat be controlled by him? Well, Paul already gave us the answer to that. The answer to that is because I'm trying to save him. Okay, it's not me. And then he goes on in verse 30, if I take part in the meal with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of something I thank God for? So if I participate with thankfulness, recognizing everything comes from God, God has provided this food, why am I denounced by who? By the Corinthians. They're the ones that are saying, you're not being kosher, or not kosher, that's a really bad choice of words. You're not being even-handed here because you're telling us we can't eat it here, but you can eat it there, and so, you're being disingenuous here by picking and choosing where you want to do things. And so he says, why am I denounced basically by you for not eating what he has given God thanks for? Offering thanks probably refers back to verse 26 where he says God has given all things. And again, this is all in answer to their opinion. I think that Paul's being inconsistent. If one says anything, if no one says anything and he has given thanks, then he shouldn't be judged for eating it. Because it's not a matter of conscience. So to the Gentile in that case, he's a Gentile. To the Jew, he's a Jew. But in that circumstance, and I think it's a great illustration, here I am in a place where I would normally be happy to eat and be able to participate fully. Another guy comes and says, that meat's been sacrificed to idol. Well, then I'm not going to eat it for his sake. Because I can't have a whole Bible class with him right now. I just won't eat. Okay? Any questions on that? So question 22 then, what are the overarching rules we should follow in this life? By the way, I have verses 31 through 33. You can also add chapter 11 and verse 1. Because this again is like one of the most egregious chapter divisions in the history of mankind. Verse 1 should go with that previous chapter. What does verse 31 start with? Therefore, or so, whatever, finally, this argument has been going since chapter 8. Okay, he's been talking about this and bringing this down to this point. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, he said. Whatever you do. He said, whatever you do. And how low can that whatever you do go? How commonplace can it be? What you ate for lunch today, or what you're drinking, whatever you do, even food or drink. In this area of things that are neither commanded nor forbidden, these areas that exist outside of any moral category, things that are indifferent, this liberty is constrained by making sure that what you're doing does what, according to verse 31? Brings glory to God. Whatever you do. That's the parameter in which it falls. So here I am sitting at home eating a chunk of meat that was offered at Jupiter's temple. How can I bring glory to God eating that?
Be thankful.
There you go. I thanked God for it. I recognize that He's the source of it. And I've acknowledged Him in doing that. Okay? And if God can't be glorified in that thing, then what should I do? Then don't do it. Whatever it is. And there was a chance, I guess, in Paul's mind that God wouldn't be glorified if I ate this in context of this person coming up and kind of warning me that it had been offered to an idol. The second rule is what?
Give no offense.
Right. Don't cause anyone to stumble, whether Jew or Greek or a brother in Christ, the church of God. Don't give any reason for anyone, a Jew, a Gentile here, which would be a non-Jewish pagan, or the church of God, which covers everybody else, which would be a believer. Don't do anything that's going to cause them to stumble. Yes?
How does that fit with Romans 14, then, where these two believers have different views of something? Wouldn't both of them have to not do that thing, do the opposite then, if they're both going to?
Well, and you know, I think that has to, there is not an overarching rule in every circumstance. And listen, and let me talk about this in a minute. Let's do it right now. Offense doesn't mean you hurt my feelings, or I don't like that you did that. Offense is it causes that person to lose their faith. Or in the case of a pagan or a Jew who's not a Christian, causes them to no longer seek the Lord. Okay, that's what offense is here. So you got two believers here, both of them very strong, and he says, I don't think you should have a beer with your lunch. Okay? It's even hard for me to say that because I can't even imagine myself having a beer with lunch. But somebody, so let me be the person. Mike, I don't think you should have a beer with your lunch. And you don't have a problem having your beer with your lunch, which in reality I don't either. But if you have a beer with your lunch, am I going to just give up my faith and leave the Lord? No.
Remember that, Mike.
No, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to lose my faith because you decided to have a beverage that I would have a question about. So while I may not like it, and you have not offended me in the sense that this is talking about.
I'm having lunch with Mike on Friday.
Yeah, they'll watch him. Report back for me here. So again, Paul's point is related to things that are intentional. How many of you have offended people without ever knowing it? All of us. Okay? In fact, how possible is it for you to go through life and never have offended anybody? It's not possible. There's tons of people, I'm sure, that are unintentionally offended by me all the time. But that's not what Paul is talking about. I'm not going to intentionally bring offense to someone. So let me back up and maybe try to illustrate that. So Eddie Pagan's watching me, but he doesn't tell me that the meat's been sacrificed to idols. And so he sees me eating it and he says, well, I guess idolatry is okay. Now, I've unintentionally, by doing something that's a liberty and an indifferent thing, perhaps offended him without ever knowing it and never knew I did. So you can't be responsible for that. But I can be responsible for the ones when I intentionally. I don't care what you think. I'm going to do this anyway. And again, offense is not just hurting someone's feelings, it's a result of your intentional actions that you cause someone either from being able to hear the gospel later from you because they don't believe you, they don't honor you, they don't trust you anymore, or you've caused somebody to lose their faith, to fall away, to be alienated from the fellowship. And Paul's bottom line here is, even as I try to please everybody in every way, for I'm not seeking my own good, but the good of the many, so that they may be saved. So freedom, in Paul's definition from chapter 8 to now, freedom is not do whatever you want without any regard to others. And also, it doesn't mean that my freedom is limited, that my conduct has to always be in accord with everybody else's conscience. That probably is not going to happen either. What I'm limited by is what glorifies God. And what can I do to help people be saved for the sake of the gospel?
Dan,
Yes.
in your question about Mike going to lunch and Mike decides to drink that beer, and you pointed out to Mike, if Mike doesn't stop drinking the beer, is Mike sinning because he's not helping you with your conscience?
No, not with me.
So you should just say, well, this would bother me, so I won't drink a beer with my lunch, but I'm not going to put my standard on
Right.
somebody else
Right.
who's a Crello Christian who doesn't have a conscience against that.
Right.
And that's where I think we miss this a lot
Right.
in our fellowship, and we keep getting smaller and
And smaller and smaller,
groups
yeah.
who say, I can't worship with that person because they don't have the same view of whatever this
Right.
issue is than me, so I better
right.
separate myself.
That's right. And so we split and divide into minuscule groups, and the old story is that this little congregation is made up of this one man and his wife. He said, yeah, we're the only faithful ones here, and I have my doubts about her. So, pardon me? He said, they're the only two Christians in town. We're the only sound ones, and I have my doubts about her, his wife. So yes, Tim.
Well, it's also a respect thing. We're as Christians, we're supposed to respect each other. And if I made you uncomfortable having a beer with you or something like that, I certainly wouldn't do it. I might have it with somebody else that doesn't mind it.
Right.
So I think,
Yeah.
not only giving glory to God, but we should kind of know some way give a little bit of glory to each other.
Right. Well, and so I'm out to eat with other people, and they order a beer with their pizza, and I don't have any. It's because I don't want it. I have the freedom not to have it. I don't feel pressured to do it, but also don't stand in judgment of them if they want to have that. Okay? Unless they get drunk, and then I'll have something to say.
You know, it's the same thing. If Mike knows that you don't do that, then he shouldn't order his beer, or I shouldn't order my beer when we're at lunch.
Right. If you knew that it was that I had that strong of an issue about it, that I'm going to lose all respect for you, and I'm start looking for somewhere else to go. Yeah. But listen, if I'm out with somebody who's a believer and they have a beer, I'm not even going to be affected by that. I'm not going to lower my opinion of them. That's Dan May in 2023, not Dan May in 2000 or 1995, or because I've grown from there. And listen, so these things certainly make it more than what Paul's talking about is talking about more than just rules of conduct, and I think that's our part. That's our point. We are making rules of conduct here. And that's not what this is intended to be, because eating and drinking makes what difference to God? None. And if you make it something, then you're making it more significant than God has. Okay? Go ahead.
I think that's Romans 14 point. If you think it's a sin and you do that, you violated your
Right.
and you made it.
The difference between Romans 14 that I'm coming to understand and 1 Corinthians 10 is Romans 14 is dealing with brethren. This is dealing with brethren, but also others. And because it's irrelevant, you can choose what is best in light of that above criterion. Is it going to bring God glory, and am I going to be able to share the gospel with people as a result of my actions? And Paul finishes off here by making himself the model of a paradigm of conduct. He says, just try to please everyone like I do. To the Jew, be the Jew. To the Gentile, be the Gentile. And don't, in the process, seek your own advantage, your own satisfaction, your own pleasure, but rather do it to seek others. Because that, he says, is exactly what Jesus did. So follow my example as I follow Christ. Paul is saying, I'm an imitation of Christ. And if I'm an imitation of Christ, and you need to see someone in the flesh in front of you that's like Christ, then go ahead and imitate me, because I'm imitating him. Okay? Wasn't this fun, going through all this? All right, I guess I should clean my glasses before I come. So let's kind of just go over to chapter 11. And this is worship and fellowship issues in Corinth. And the first question is, what does Paul commend them for? And why do you think he states this here? Let me just give you a kind of a rundown as to what we're going to be looking at here in this chapter. Because after prohibiting the Corinthians to be participants in pagan worship, which is what this last 3 chapters have been about, 8, 9, and 10. Not about whether you eat, what the origin of your meat is that you're eating, but actually participating in pagan worship in a pagan temple and saying you can't do that. Now he's going to deal with 3 items of abuse that they have in their assemblies there in Corinth. I think it's kind of my opinion here that what he talks about here in verse 11, or chapter 11, is stuff he's heard about. If you go down to verse 18, in the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church. And so I think this is a report. I don't know if it's from Chloe's servants or who they are, but I think what he's dealing with here in chapter 11, he's heard about. Because what does he always say when he's answering a question in their letter? Go to chapter 7 and verse 1. He says, now for the matters you wrote about, and then that's about marriage. Now what does he say in the verse 1 of chapter 8? Now about meat sacrificed to idols. And he's in verse 25 of chapter 7, now about virgins. Okay? We don't see that again until chapter 12 when he says, now about spiritual gifts.
Yeah, he's talking like he's been reported, he's gotten some reports on it.
Well, so chapter 11 is that.
Yeah.
Chapter 7, 8, that first part anyway, that was brought us on here, is all questions that they've asked. They've written to him about these things, and they're seeking information. But chapter 11 is just kind of stuck in here because this is a good time to discuss it. Yeah, I've told you what you can't do. Now, by the way, here's some things that I know that you have issues to. I'm going to be dealing with spiritual gifts because you talked about that. You asked me about that. I'll tell you about that. I think he's going to do the same thing chapter 15, I think, comes up with the resurrection. Chapter 16, though, again, now about the collection. And so I think he's just figured that right here, the Holy Spirit figured that right here is a good time to bring up this whole thing that's going on with regards to how they are attired while they're praying and prophesying. That's chapter 11, verses 2 through 16. And their abuse of the poor in the Lord's Supper, also in chapter 11, from verses 17 through verse 34. And then the abuse of tongues in the assembly is going to come up in chapters 12, 13, and 14. So with all three of these abuses, he's going to give an answer, but he's also going to give them more information than probably what they wanted, which I think Paul just has a tendency to do. You're probably saying, I do the same thing when I'm teaching this class. I don't need all that information. We could have been done with 1 Corinthians a year ago. But I think they must have said in their letter, somewhere along the line, to Paul, by the way, we are remembering the traditions that you sent to us. We are remembering those, which is why he starts off this section with, I thank God, or I praise you for remembering me and everything. And I will tell you, that's the first positive thing he said to them since chapter 1 when he thanked God that they had spiritual gifts. It's been pretty hot and heavy and critical and argumentative up to that. And so I'm going to stop there tonight. I've given you that opening. And so we'll talk about what Paul commended them for and why he said that here. I would just, and again, Daniel's not here, so he's not going to take me further. But you'll notice in verse 2, I praise you for this. What's the first word in verse 7? Or what's the phrase in verse 17? I have no praise for you in this. So, praise you for this, no praise for that. And so then he takes off again. So, I will tell you, just as a preliminary thing here, again, I think I have learned so much about chapter 11 that I didn't know before. We don't have very much of an issue with this up here in the pagan Northwest. If you've ever been to the South, in churches in the South, where there's many women who wear veil at services, and it seems to be a regional kind of a thing. There's other places. I'm not saying it's not everywhere. Other places, but I have never really, I think, understood this like I am going to be able to share with you now on chapter 11. And just because I give you what I think doesn't mean that everybody's going to say, oh, Dan has spoken, spread the word so everybody can believe it. Everything that I say here, there's going to be people that won't agree with it. I'm just letting you know that. So, all right. So thank you. We did make it to chapter 11. Thank you. Barely.